Here we explore the human experience through the mind, the body, and the soul. Mind Lounge is not about answers. It's about insight. Settle in. Open your mind. Let the conversation begin.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today I am ready to get my hands dirty.
Okay.
And I mean that, well, almost literally. We are heading into the workshop today. We're talking about, the smell of molten plastic, the whine of those little stepper motors, and that really specific feeling of satisfaction you get when you actually build something with your own two hands.
It's good to be here. And you're right. This topic, it hits a very specific nerve. It's about that almost primal urge to create.
Yeah.
To take raw material, whether it's wood, metal, or, in this case, a spool of PLA filament, and turn it into something functional, something that's yours.
Exactly. And I want to start by, really setting the scene for everyone listening. I want you to close your eyes for a second.
Okay.
Unless you're driving, of course.
Yeah.
Please don't close your eyes if you're driving. But
go.
just picture this. You're a maker.
Right.
And maybe you don't call yourself that. Maybe you're just a person who likes to fix things. You've got a garage or a basement, maybe a spare bedroom that your significant other is just a little bit annoyed about.
Because it's full of wires and tools, the classic lab setup.
Right, the lab. You've got a soldering iron that has definitely burned your finger at least once. You've got those little jars of screws you'll never use but can't throw away. And sitting right in the center of the workbench, glowing with a soft LED light, is the crown jewel of the modern hobbyist, the 3D printer.
It really has become the icon of this modern era of self-reliance, hasn't it? It is, for all intents and purposes, a factory in a box.
It is.
It represents this incredible shift from just being a consumer to being a producer.
It feels like magic. I remember the first time I saw one work. You download a file, you hit a button, and this machine just it just dances. Layer by tiny layer, it summons an object into existence.
Yeah.
You break a knob on your dishwasher. You don't wait 2 weeks for some overpriced part to ship from who knows where. You print it. You need a custom bracket for your car. You print it. It is the ultimate expression of, I can do this myself.
It's the democratization of manufacturing. That's what it is. It's taking the power that used to belong to these massive industrial conglomerate.
Right, these huge corporations.
And putting it on a desk in the suburbs, in a home office.
But now I want to shift the scene a little bit. I want to introduce the tension that's really going to drive our deep dive today.
Okay.
Imagine you buy a brand new, high-end printer. It's slick, it's fast. You bring it home, you unbox it, you peel off that satisfying protective plastic film.
That's the best part.
Oh, it's the best part. You smell that fresh factory electronic smell. You download a file. Maybe it's a tool you need. Maybe it's a replacement part for a vintage rifle you're restoring. Or maybe it's just a little toy boat for your kid. You hit print. And then nothing. Just silence. The nozzle doesn't heat up. The cooling fans don't spin. The machine just sits there completely inert.
Why?
Because a database somewhere in the cloud, managed by the state government, has analyzed your file and said, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't let you do that.
Oh, wow. That is a chilling thought. It sounds like science fiction, doesn't it?
It really does.
Like something out of a dystopian novel where the machines, they run the show and they're all networked to the government.
But that is exactly what we are unpacking today. And the thing is, this isn't fiction.
Yeah.
This is based on a very real, very controversial piece of legislation. We are diving headfirst into a collision course.
Right.
On one side, you've got the maker movement, personal liberty, property rights, the simple freedom to tinker. And on the other side, you have government security measures and this, desperate need to keep the public safe.
And the stakes here are they're massive. This isn't just about printing little plastic toys. This is about the fundamental relationship between the citizen and the state.
And that gets to the big question we're asking today. And it's a question that just kept popping up in all the research for all the sources. It's this. Are we truly free if we don't actually own the hardware we buy? Or are we just leasing permission from the government to use it?
It brings up a fundamental question of society, really. Is the trade-off worth it? Are we trading too much of our liberty for just a sense of security?
To help us navigate this minefield, we have stacked three very different but strangely connected sources. First, we've got a deep dive into that piece of legislation I mentioned, House Bill 2321 out of Washington State.
Right.
This is the catalyst for our whole conversation.
Right. That's the what. But to really understand the why, why a government would even want that level of control, we're going to be looking at source 3, which is a philosophical breakdown of Thomas Hobbes.
Thomas Hobbes.
Yeah. We're going way back to the 17th century to talk about the social contract and this idea of the Leviathan.
And finally, because we are in America and we care about where the lines are drawn, we're looking at source 1, which is a crash course on the First Amendment. Does the Constitution actually protect your right to print whatever you want? Is code speech.
It's a legal, philosophical, and technological knot, a big one.
So let's untie it. Let's start with the thing that sparked this whole debate, the legislation itself. We're looking at source 2, which is a detailed analysis of Washington State House Bill 2321. Now, usually when we talk about legislation on the show,
Relax. Eyes start to glaze over.
But this is spicy.
It is spicy, not because of the language, but because of the precedent it sets.
So let's unpack the specifics. What exactly is this bill proposing?
Well, on the surface, if you just read the summary, it sounds like a pretty standard safety regulation. The bill mandates that all 3D printers sold in the state of Washington must include blocking features.
Blocking features. That sounds incredibly vague. What does that actually mean in practice?
It's actually quite specific in its implications. These features would be managed by a software control process. So essentially, the machine isn't just a dumb terminal anymore that executes your G-code commands.
Right.
It has a gatekeeper built right into the operating system.
And how does this gatekeeper, decide what gets through and what doesn't?
That's the kicker. That's the core of it. The source explains that every single design, every file you try to print must be verified against a state-managed database before the printer will actually initiate the print.
Oh, wait, let me make sure I'm understanding the mechanics here.
Huh.
So before I can print, say, a plastic hook for my shower curtain, my printer essentially has to call home to the government and ask, is this okay?
Effectively, yes. The mechanism implies a constant internet connection, or at the very least, a mandatory verification step. The software analyzes the file, most likely by hashing it, turning the file into a unique digital fingerprint.
Sure.
And then comparing that fingerprint to a list. If your design matches something on a prohibited list, or maybe if it doesn't match something on an approved list, the printer simply will not work. It'll just sit there.
That is a massive shift in how we think about tools. My hammer doesn't ask for permission before I hit a nail. My table saw doesn't check a database before I cut a piece of wood.
Exactly. And that's why the source uses a very specific term to describe this whole thing. They call it a Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse. Wow, that's a strong metaphor. It implies there's a trick, right? It implies something that looks like a gift, but is actually an attack.
Precisely. The argument that's presented in the source is that this bill is framed as a public safety measure. The implication, of course, is that they want to stop people from printing dangerous items, ghost guns, weapons, components that could hurt people.
Right.
That's the gift of safety. We are keeping you safe from criminals.
And look, nobody wants bad guys printing guns. That's the sales pitch, and it's a good one. It's hard to argue against safety.
It's impossible to argue against. But the attack, or, the soldiers hiding inside the horse, is this massive seizure of control. The source argues that to achieve this so-called safety, manufacturers would be required by law to lock users out of their own hardware.
How so?
Well, to make sure you can't bypass the database check, they have to lock the doors to the whole system.
This is the part that really gets to me. Locking users out. We're talking about a machine I bought with my own money, sitting on my own desk in my own house.
But do you really own it if you can't control it? That's the philosophical and the practical question here. The source argues that this effectively ends the concept of ownership for the device.
How can it end ownership? I have the receipt.
Sure, but if the operating system is locked down, if the firmware is encrypted to prevent you from bypassing this check, you are no longer the owner in any meaningful sense. You are just a user. You're a tenant on your own property.
It's like buying a car. But the manufacturer welds the hood shut and says, don't worry about what's in there. We'll decide where you're allowed to drive, and we'll decide when the engine starts.
Or even more accurately, we'll decide which roads the engine is allowed to turn on for. If you try to turn onto a dirt road that isn't on the government's approved map, the car just shuts off.
Wow. Now, I want to talk about the maker specifically, the hobbyist. Because this isn't just about stopping people from making guns, is it? The source goes into great detail about how this affects innovation across the board.
Oh, the collateral damage is immense.
It's not just stopping weapons, it's stopping, well, everything else.
It is. The source highlights the issue of custom firmware. Now, for the listeners who aren't deep into the 3D printing hobby, this might sound a bit technical, but it's absolutely crucial to understand why the community is so upset about this.
Yeah, let's break that down. Custom firmware is huge in the 3D printing world. I mean, I've dabbled a bit myself. You can buy a pretty cheap printer from overseas. The hardware might be okay, but the software is clunky, it's slow.
Right.
So you wipe it. You flash some community-made firmware onto it, like Marlin or Clipper, and suddenly this cheap machine is performing like a high-end one.
Exactly. That is the lifeblood of the hobbyist community. People tinker, they find bugs, they fix them, they improve the code, they share that code freely. The source points out that custom firmware is currently used for really significant performance enhancements.
Like what?
Well, we're talking about better thermal control to prevent fires, which is a safety feature, ironically enough.
So the community is actually making the machine safer.
In many cases, yes. They're adding features like input shaping to cancel out vibrations, which makes prints faster and much, much smoother. The community moves faster than the corporations do.
But under this bill, all of that just stopped.
It grinds to a halt.
Why? How?
Because if the manufacturers are required by law to secure the device against tampering, to ensure the blocking software can't be bypassed, they have to lock the bootloader.
The bootloader, that's the tiny little program that loads the main operating system when you turn it on.
Right. It's the key to the castle. If they lock that, and if they encrypt the firmware with the digital signature, you cannot install anything that hasn't been approved and signed by the manufacturer or, by extension, the state. You cannot upgrade your own machine.
So it freezes innovation. Just stops it in its tracks.
It completely freezes it. The source calls it an open source crisis. Even if you have brilliant open source software that could make printing safer or faster or more eco-friendly, it becomes totally useless. The hardware will just reject it because it doesn't have the government stamp of approval.
It's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
It really is. It takes this dynamic, evolving ecosystem and just turns it into a stagnant, walled garden.
Exactly.
And it connects to something we've talked about in other deep dives, this whole concept of the right to repair.
It's a fundamental attack on the right to repair. The source frames it in exactly that way. I mean, think about it. If the OS is locked and the firmware is encrypted, what happens when a sensor breaks? What happens if you want to swap out the hot end for a different brand so you can print with different materials?
The machine just throws an error code, right? It says unauthorized hardware detected and refuses to work.
Precisely. It's the same problem that farmers are facing with their tractors or that people face with their smartphones. But it's now being applied to a machine whose entire purpose is modification and creation. It's absurd.
And what happens if the manufacturer stops supporting that model? Or worse, what happens if the company goes bankrupt and the verification server just shuts down?
You're left with a paperweight, a very expensive, very high-tech paperweight.
Wow.
And that leads to a massive increase in e-waste. It creates this total dependency on the manufacturer that didn't exist before. Right now, 3D printers are incredibly repairable. Most of the parts are generic, stepper motors, belts, nozzles. You can buy them anywhere. The software is open. This bill would turn them into these sealed black boxes that you can't touch.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting and frankly a bit infuriating for a lot of people in this space. The source positions this whole debate as a battle between the lawful citizen and the bad actor.
Yes. And this, according to the critics, is the critical flaw in the logic of the entire bill. Who is this law actually stopping?
Right. Think about it. The bad actor, the criminal, the person who actually wants to do harm, they're going to follow this law, are they?
No, that's the literal definition of a criminal. They break laws.
So what's to stop them?
That is the classic argument against this type of regulation. A criminal or a felon in the context of weapons is already breaking the law just by possessing a weapon if they're a prohibited person.
Yeah.
They are highly motivated to find ways around digital locks.
Or, and this seems more likely, they'll just build their own machine from scratch.
Exactly. And this is a point we really need to drive home for anyone listening. 3D printers are not magic boxes that only exist because a corporation sells them. At their core, they are just motors, rails, and a simple microcontroller.
Yeah.
If I'm a criminal mastermind or even just a dedicated hobbyist with bad intentions, I'm not going to my local big box store to buy a 3D printer and register it with a state database. That's insane.
No. You're going online, buying some stepper motors, an Arduino or a Raspberry Pi, and building your own controller. The source makes the point that all the knowledge is already out there. The whole RepRap project was built on this idea, a printer that can print its own parts.
You can use parts from old scanners and inkjet printers to build one. It's not hard for someone who's determined.
So if the bad guys can just build their own unregulated machines,
Then who do these restrictions actually fall on?
the lawful citizen,
Ooh,
the hobbyist, the teacher in classroom trying to show students how G-code works.
exactly. The source argues that these restrictions punish law-abiding tinkerers and the natural curiosity of regular citizens in a completely futile attempt to stop bad actors who won't be affected by the law in the first place.
And this touches on a historical point that I think is vital here. We have to talk about the history of making things in this country, because the source brings up this idea that making isn't new.
Not at all. It's ancient.
Specifically, let's talk about firearms, since that is clearly the elephant in the room with this bill. From the very start of this country, every generation has been able to metalsmith their own firearms. A person could forge a rifle in their own workshop.
That's a historical fact. Before mass manufacturing, if you needed a tool or a weapon, you often made it yourself, or the local blacksmith made it for you. It has always been legal in the United States for a law-abiding citizen to manufacture a firearm for their own personal use.
Right. You don't need a license to make a gun for yourself. You need a license to sell it. But to make it, that's always been part of this tradition of self-reliance.
And the argument here is, if you are not a convicted felon, if you are a lawful citizen, why are we suddenly placing these massive, unprecedented restrictions on your ability to create?
It feels like a presumption of guilt.
It does. It assumes that because the tool can be used for illegal purposes, the lawful citizen shouldn't be trusted with an unlocked version of it. It's a fundamental shift from punish the crime to prevent the capability.
And that prevent the capability mindset is exactly what leads to the slippery slope argument. This is the part of the source analysis that really gave me pause.
The baby steps to control.
Yeah. Tell me about the list. Because the source didn't just stop at 3D printers, did they? They looked at the logic of the bill and asked, okay, if this passes, what's next?
No, they didn't stop. And this is where you have to look ahead. The source asks, if this legal framework passes for 3D printers, if we as a society accept the premise that machines capable of making dangerous things must be locked down, then what is the logical next step?
Right. Where does that logic lead?
They list CNC machines.
Computer numerical control. So basically subtractive manufacturing. Instead of adding plastic, you're milling away a block of metal or wood.
Exactly. And let's be honest, a CNC machine can make a gun receiver out of solid aluminum or steel. That's arguably much more real and durable than a plastic one from a printer.
So logically, if you ban open 3D printers to stop ghost guns, you have to ban open CNC mills too.
You have to. Then what about laser cutters?
Laser cutters, and eventually personal computers.
That's the nightmare scenario.
It really is.
It is. The ultimate fear that's expressed in the source is a future where you don't truly own any of your technology. Imagine if your laptop operating system had the same requirement. Before you can save a Word document, before you can compile a piece of code, before you can edit a video, the OS has to check a state database to make sure the content is safe.
It sounds Orwellian, but we've seen this pattern before, and this is where the source brings in the comparison to the Patriot Act.
That's a very apt comparison, I think.
Think about it. The Patriot Act was passed in the wake of 9/11. We were terrified. And it was sold as a tool to surveil foreign terrorists, to stop the bad guys.
Right. It was safety first, national security.
But what did it become? Over time, it became a tool to surveil U.S. citizens. The scope creep was undeniable.
That is exactly the fear here. This bill is the Patriot Act for manufacturing. It starts with something that sounds reasonable to the average person who isn't a hobbyist. Quote, we need to stop terrorists from printing machine guns.
Sure.
But once that infrastructure is in place, once the database exists and every printer is wired to check it, what's next?
Maybe next year they decide that printing copyrighted material is a danger to the economy, so they add those files to the block list. Then maybe they decide that printing drug paraphernalia is a public health danger. then maybe they decide that printing parts to fix your own gas stove is dangerous because you aren't a certified technician.
It's the definition of a slippery slope. These are just the beginning, the baby steps, into more and more government control. It shifts the entire default setting of society from allowed unless prohibited to prohibited unless allowed.
And it brings us right back to that core question from our listener persona. Are we self-reliant? Are we self-sufficient? And are we free anymore?
If you have to ask a government server for permission to use a tool in your own basement, the answer to all of those is increasingly no.
Okay, so we have the maker's perspective. It's a Trojan horse, it destroys the hobby, it punishes the innocent while the criminals just ignore it. But
Yeah.
and I had to play devil's advocate here.
Please do.
Governments don't usually just wake up and decide to be evil villains for no reason.
No, they don't. That's too simplistic. There's always a reason.
Usually there's a fear, a justification. And understand that justification. We need to step back, not just a few years, but about 400 years.
Let's go to the 17th century.
Let's bring in source 3, Thomas Hobbes, the man, the myth, the legend of why we need a strong government.
Thomas Hobbes is absolutely essential here because he articulates the other side of this coin better than anyone else in history. You cannot understand the argument for a bill like this without understanding him. He wrote his masterpiece, Leviathan, in 1651.
1651. And context is really important here. He wasn't writing this in a peaceful, quiet library, was he?
No, not at all. He was writing during the English Civil War.
Which was an incredibly messy, bloody time.
Unbelievably bloody. It was chaos, neighbors killing neighbors, the king was beheaded. It was the total breakdown of society. So Hobbes looked at the world around him, this absolute carnage, and he asked a really fundamental question. What is life like without a government? What is the state of nature?
And he had a pretty catchy slogan for it.
He did. It's one of the most famous lines in all of philosophy. He said that in a state of nature, without a common power to keep us all in awe, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Nasty, brutish, and short. I feel like I've been to parties like that.
We all have. But for Hobbes, this wasn't just a bad party. This was a war of all against all. He believed that humans are naturally competitive and fearful. If there's no police, no law, and no one to stop me from taking what you have,
Then you're going to take it.
I'm going to take it. And you're going to try to kill me to stop me. And I'm going to try to kill you first to prevent that. It's constant fear.
So in the state of nature, I have total freedom, right? Of the absolute freedom to do whatever I want.
Absolute liberty. You have the right to everything. You even have the right to one another's bodies, as Hobbes so grimly put it. But that absolute liberty results in absolute insecurity. You are free to do whatever you want, but you are also free to be murdered in your sleep because the other guy is free to murder you.
Not a great trade-off.
No, it's terrifying. So Hobbes introduces his solution, the social contract.
Okay, walk us through that. How do we escape this nasty, brutish life?
The social contract is a mutual agreement. We all get together, metaphorically, of course, and we say, okay, this constant fear of death is terrible. I will agree to give up some of my natural liberty. I won't just take your stuff. I won't hurt you if and only if you agree to do the same.
But promises aren't enough, are they? People break promises all the time.
Correct. As Hobbes famously said, covenants without the sword are but words. You need an enforcer. You need a powerful third party to make sure everyone sticks to the deal. That is the Leviathan, the sovereign, the state.
So we surrender our individual freedom to the Leviathan in exchange for collective safety.
Exactly. We trade liberty for security. We say, I give up my right to use violence, and I hand that right over to the state so that the state can use the threat of violence to protect all of us.
Now, let's bring this back to 2026 and 3D printers. Because when I read about this Washington bill, it feels like we are seeing a very specific, very modern version of this social contract being proposed.
It is an almost perfect parallel. Just look at the Washington bill again. The government, the Leviathan, is saying to its citizens, the state of nature regarding 3D printing is becoming too dangerous.
They're seeing the potential for nasty, brutish things. The ghost guns, the untraceable weapons, the idea that anyone, anywhere, can print a machine gun in their basement.
Right. They are saying, if we leave you with absolute liberty to print whatever you want, some of you will inevitably print things that kill other people. That creates chaos. That creates insecurity for everyone.
So the offer on the table is surrender your liberty Give up the freedom to print unverified files. Give up total control of your hardware. And in exchange, we, the state, will give you security. We will ensure that no dangerous weapons are printed.
That is the deal on the table. It is a modern social contract for manufacturing. Give us the keys to your printer, and we will give you a safer society. But, and Hobbes himself knew this, there is a huge catch.
There's always a catch.
The catch is the sheer amount of power you have to give the Leviathan. To ensure peace, the sovereign has to be incredibly, overwhelmingly powerful. Hobbes justified a near-absolute monarchy.
He thought tyranny was better than anarchy.
He literally did. He thought a dictator was better than a civil war, because at least under a dictator, you're not constantly afraid of your neighbor murdering you.
But the source material warns us about this, about creating a frighteningly powerful state.
Yes, because if the state-managed database is the new Leviathan, think about the power that grants. The state now has a window into every single creative act you perform with that tool in your home. They have the power to turn off your private property remotely.
It really raises the question, is the state becoming too powerful in its pursuit of safety?
And that is the perfect synthesis of Source 2 and Source 3. Source 2 fears the Trojan horse of total control. Source 3 explains why the state wants that control in the first place, to prevent the nasty, brutish outcome. The conflict is that the maker community believes we can have a civil society without surrendering that level of control. They believe the cost of this particular social contract is just too high.
It's like the terms of service for society have been updated, and we're all just scrolling to the bottom trying to decide if we should click I accept.
And once you click accept, it's very, very hard to go back. Once you give the Leviathan the sword, you can't easily ask for it back.
Okay, so we have the maker's outrage, we have the philosopher's justification. Now I want to bring in the lawyer.
Right.
Because this is America, and we have a constitution.
Yeah.
We have limits on what the Leviathan is allowed to do.
The supreme law of the land.
We're looking at Source 1 now, the crash course on government and politics. And the question I have, the one that this all hinges on, is code speech.
This is one of the most fascinating and unresolved legal frontiers of the digital age. It's where technology runs headfirst into the First Amendment.
Okay, let's break it down. If I write a poem about a gun, that's clearly speech. Protected.
Absolutely. No question.
If I read a blueprint for a gun on a napkin, drawings, dimensions, that's speech. It's information. Protected.
Yes. Information is speech.
But if I write a digital file, a string of G code that tells a printer how to make a gun, is that speech? Or is that a weapon? Or is it a machine part? What is it?
That is the million-dollar legal question. Source 1 breaks down the purpose of free speech for us. Why do we even have it?
It says the primary reason is to allow public criticism of the government.
Right. At its core, it's political. It's about checking power. And importantly, the First Amendment protects individuals from government action. A private company can censor you. Facebook can kick you off their platform, but the government cannot silence you.
And since House Bill 2321 is a government mandate, the First Amendment absolutely applies.
It absolutely applies. The government is forcing restrictions on what information you can transfer from your computer to your machine.
So let's look at the levels of protection. Source 1 mentions that political speech gets the strongest protection there is.
Yes, and there's a landmark case mentioned. Brandenburg v. Ohio. It established that you can even advocate for the use of force or for violating the law. You can stand on a soapbox and say, we should overthrow the government, or we should all break this unjust law.
Wait, really? I
Yeah.
can say that. I can tell people to break the law.
You can, unless, and this is the crucial exception, your speech is directed at inciting imminent lawless action and is likely to produce it.
Imminent lawless action. Okay, that sounds like the exact loophole the government would try to use here.
It is the legal battleground. The government's lawyers would almost certainly argue that distributing a 3D printable gun file or allowing a printer to print it creates an immediate danger. They'd say it facilitates imminent lawless action, which would be the creation of an illegal or untraceable weapon.
But is it imminent? That's the word that sticks for me. If I start printing a plastic lower receiver, it takes hours, maybe 12, 15 hours for a good one.
And that's just for one part of the whole assembly.
Exactly. Then I have to clean it up. I have to assemble it with a bunch of metal parts, barrels, slides, springs that I have to buy separately. Then I have to find ammunition. It's not like shouting fire in a crowded theater where people get trampled instantly.
That is precisely the counter-argument. The maker defense is that the file is just information. It requires significant time, effort, and additional components to become dangerous. It's not a bomb that explodes when you click download. It's an instruction set.
The courts have struggled with this, right? This
Huh?
line between code and action.
They have. Generally, source code, the human readable stuff, is considered speech. But the code that directly executes a physical function, like the binary that runs the machine, that sits in a really weird gray area. Is it speech or is it a device? If I email you the code, it's speech. If I plug it into the machine, is it action? The law is still catching up.
Let's talk about prior restraint,
Yeah.
because that came up in my reading of the source, and it feels absolutely pivotal here.
Yes, this is a vital concept in First Amendment law. Prior restraint is when the government stops you from speaking before you even open your mouth.
That's censorship.
It is the definition of censorship. And in the US, the courts hate prior restraint. The standard is usually, you are free to speak, but if your speech breaks the law like defamation or true threats or perjury, you get punished for it afterwards.
So, in the context of 3D printing, what does that mean for the current situation?
The current model is, you are free to own a printer, you are free to own the files. But if you print an illegal machine gun with it, you are arrested after you do it. You are punished for the criminal action.
With this bill.
This bill is pure prior restraint. It stops the action before it can even happen. The database checks your file and says no. It silences the machine before it can speak the object into existence.
That feels like a massive constitutional shift. It shifts the burden of proof, doesn't it? It assumes you're guilty. It assumes that unless the database says yes, you are about to do something wrong.
It does. It completely reverses the presumption of innocence. And Source 1 mentions that while even hate speech is protected, violence is not. The government is trying to classify the act of manufacturing unapproved items as a form of violence, not speech.
It's so tricky. Because on one hand, I get it. A gun is not a pamphlet. It shoots bullets. It can kill people. But on the other hand, the instructions to make the gun are just information.
And if you start banning information or the tools required to use that information, you are entering very dangerous territory. Remember the symbolic speech part of Source 1? Things like wearing armbands in protest or burning flags.
Yeah.
The act of making things can be symbolic speech. The maker movement views the very act of creation as a form of expression. I built this. It's an expression of self-reliance, of independence. If the government blocks that expression because it might be dangerous, they are severely limiting the scope of personal liberty.
And we circle right back to the slippery slope. If they can use prior restraint on a 3D printer because it's deemed dangerous, can they use prior restraint on my blog post because it might incite unrest? Can they use it on my emails?
That is the fear. Once you establish the infrastructure for prior restraint, this state-managed database that verifies every action becomes very, very easy to add new things to the banned list.
Okay, we've covered the bill, the technical lockout. We've covered the philosophy Hobbes and the fear of chaos. We've covered the law, prior restraint, and free speech. Now, I want to try and synthesize all of this. I want to connect the dots between the Trojan horse, the Leviathan, and the Constitution.
Let's do it.
We started with the maker's dilemma. The user profile for this episode asked about self-reliance. Are we truly free?
It's a heavy question. It's the question, really.
If we look at these three sources together, a clearer picture starts to form. The maker from source 2 wants to innovate. They want to push boundaries. They represent the liberty side of the equation. They represent the state of nature in its most positive sense, unbounded creativity.
Right. They're the optimists. They believe that people are generally good and should be trusted with tools.
Then you have the state, as seen through the eyes of Hobbes in source 3. The state wants to prevent the nasty, brutish outcome. They see the potential for unregulated weapons to turn society into a war zone. They represent the security side of the equation.
They're the pessimists. They believe people are inherently dangerous and need to be controlled for their own good.
And the law, from source 1, is stuck right in the middle, trying to figure out if a 3D printer is a printing press or if it's a gun factory.
That's a great way to frame it. And the Trojan horse metaphor from Source 2 becomes even more poignant when you view it through the lens of Hobbes.
How so?
Well, Hobbes argues that we voluntarily create the Leviathan. We asked for it because we're afraid. So the Trojan horse isn't necessarily being wheeled in by an enemy army. We might be the ones opening the gates and wheeling it in ourselves.
Whoa, explain that.
Well, if people are terrified of ghost guns, if the media narrative is that unregulated 3D printing leads to chaos and school shootings and terrorism, then the public might actually demand this bill. They might say, please, government, protect us from this.
So we invite the horse in, we accept the software locks, we accept the database because we're scared.
Because we fear the state of nature more than we fear the loss of ownership. We prioritize survival over abstract liberty. But once the horse is inside the city walls, once that infrastructure is built, the end of ownership that Source 2 warns about becomes a reality.
And that reality is, you don't own the tool. You operate it by the grace of the state.
And if you cannot repair your own tools, as Source 2 points out, and if you must rely on the Leviathan for your physical security, and you rely on a database for your permission to even create,
Then you are not self-reliant.
you are dependent. You are, in a very real sense, a subject, not a citizen.
That hits hard. A subject, not a citizen. A citizen has inalienable rights. A subject has permissions that can be revoked.
It raises the question of whether freedom in the modern technological age is becoming an illusion. We have the illusion of choice. Look at all these cool things. I can 3D print. I can print baby Yodas. I can print vases. But the reality is that the boundaries of that choice are being drawn tighter and tighter by algorithms we can't see and don't control.
And it's invisible. That's the scary part, isn't it? It's not a soldier standing in your living room telling you no, it's a line of code. It's a silent verification failed error message on a screen. It's sterile. It's clean.
Which brings us back to the surveillance aspect, the database. To verify your design, the state has to see your design.
Yeah. The file has to be uploaded or at the very least hashed and compared against their list.
That is a level of surveillance into creative work that Hobbes couldn't have even dreamed of. The Leviathan had spies and eyes on the street, but it didn't have a camera in everyone's workshop. Now, potentially, it does.
It's the panopticon,
Yeah.
the all-seeing eye.
And if you are a lawful citizen, as Source 2 emphasizes over and over, you are the one being surveilled. You are the one having your privacy invaded every single time you hit print, just to prove you aren't a bad actor.
While the actual bad actor is in their basement with a soldering iron and a hacksaw or a homemade controller, completely ignoring the whole system.
Exactly. The social contract breaks down if the bad guys don't have to sign it, but all the good guys have to pay the price.
This has been heavy, but incredibly important. I think we need to wrap this up and give the listeners something to walk away with.
Let's summarize.
We looked at Washington House Bill 2321. It proposes locking down 3D printers with software that checks a state database before every print. Critics call it a Trojan horse that kills the concept of ownership and the right to repair.
We looked at Thomas Hobbes and the social contract, the idea that we trade our freedom for security to avoid a nasty, brutish life. But the risk is creating a state that is too powerful, a Leviathan that controls too much of our lives.
And we looked at the First Amendment, the ongoing struggle to define if code is speech, and the dangerous precedent of prior restraint stopping the creation of information before it even happens, which is something the Constitution is supposed to prevent.
It's a triad of technology, philosophy, and law, and they're all pulling in very different directions.
So here is where we leave you. We talked about the maker's dilemma. We talked about the fear of the unknown.
And the future of self-reliance.
I want to leave you with one final thought, a question to mull over while you're driving or doing the dishes or maybe staring at your own 3D printer, wondering what it's thinking.
Go for it.
We often think of freedom as the ability to speak or to vote or to travel. But in a world that is increasingly made of things, is freedom actually the ability to make? If a machine in your own home has to ask the government for permission before it works, have we actually entered a new state of nature? One where we are physically safe? Sure. But perhaps no longer truly free.
That is the question.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. Keep tinkering, keep questioning, and we'll see you next time.
Stay curious.